Deputy Speaker, I take great pride in being in this chamber today supporting the member for Holt by speaking in support of the motion that she has moved here today, standing in support of Australia's migrant workforce and all migrant workers in our country. It should not come as a surprise to see members from this side of the chamber to stand up in support of workers, and especially those workers who have migrated to Australia on a temporary basis. Whether their purpose for coming to Australia was to work, or whether they are working in addition to studying in Australia, or whether they have been engaged in an unscrupulous employer to work outside of the conditions of their visa. If you're working in Australia, you deserve the ability to do so free from exploitation, free from the possibility of exploitation. Whether that exploitation is in the form of underpayment of wages or conditions they are entitled to, or even at the minimum legal standard, whether that is at a rate they are entitled to, all the way through to making migrant workers work beyond the conditions of their visa, or even withholding a migrant worker's passport. Sadly, the list is significantly longer than these examples. And further to this, Deputy Speaker, it should come as no surprise that it is a Labor government that comes to this parliament to stand up for the rights of working people, to make it harder for employers to get away with exploiting our migrant workforce, harder to exploit all workers. Every one of us, after hearing that up to 1 in 6 migrants to Australia is paid less than the minimum wage, should be a statistic that should shock us all to our core. You just don't want to think that it's right, but we all know it is. And we can't ignore our obligations, our duty as parliamentarians to stop this from happening. I know I won't. I know that the member for Holt won't. I know the member for Tagney won't. And I especially know that the Albanese Labor government won't, and the member for Solomon. Those of us from the union movement can point to a number of examples that would count as horror stories of migrant workers' exploitation in its own right. But the catalyst for action was the systemic breaches that were uncovered in 7-Eleven's stores. And luckily for those who had worked or were working at 7-Eleven at the time, and for that matter, migrant workers across Australia who were experiencing systematic breaches of their workplace rights or entitlements, regardless of whether they knew this at the time or not. These reports were so flagrant and so well documented by the media at the time, it shocked the conscience to such an extent that the Turnbull government was forced to act. And so the Migrant Workers Task Force was created to provide a report to the government at the time on an issue that was at least our side of politics was not naively unaware of, but at the end of the day, the providing of recommendations as part of the report to government might just be what the doctor ordered. However, the previous government would do what they did best. After all, as we all know, the report was first commissioned back when Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister. The task force finally delivered its report to the government well after the member for Cook was ambitious for Malcolm and subsequently was Prime Minister himself. The Morrison government received that report in February 2019, with the government's response being provided in early March of 2019, with an election held not long after that. Then, nearly one whole parliament later, the Morrison government introduced the Migration Amendment, Protecting Migrant Workers Bill 2021, and did so at the end of November 2021, knowing they were only going to have a handful of sitting days in the next year before they called an election. And with many other things in the life of that government, they achieved what they wanted to achieve, being able to say they did something while they run out the clock. It may have taken a change of 2 Prime Ministers since the task force inception, but most importantly, it took a change of government. But now, we finally have a government, an Albanese Labor government, that is introducing legislation into this place to protect our migrant workforce from exploitative practices from employers or prospective employers. Whether you want to say that the previous government's lack of real action to legislate on this matter was by circumstance or design, it is frankly no coincidence that it is Labor that is standing up for all working people, regardless of their origin. For if they work on our shores, it means they are deserving of our protection in the workplace. Thank you, Speaker.